The next point is that, the next interest that the oppressor might have is that the structure of the oppressive system, the system itself, if I were to bracket everything, right? The structure of this oppressive, and this would be the banking, this banking theory, right? The structure of the oppressive system is one wherein the oppressed are marginalized, right? The oppressed are marginalized, right? So the assumption is that the oppressed are marginalized, and we'll talk about sort of the marginalization of the oppressed in a minute. How does this look, right? When we're talking about marginalization, right? When we're talking about marginalization, what are we talking about? Well, you can imagine that we have society, right? And on the periphery, right? On the periphery, on the very outside of society, just on the periphery. This is all conceptual, of course, right? We have the marginal, right? So we have society, and we have members of society here, right? We have members of society, but on the periphery, on the outside of society, we have those who are marginal, the marginalized, right? The assumption is that we have members of society within, and we have those outside, right? This is the assumption. I don't think I'm saying anything that you haven't heard before, right? So that's the first assumption. The next assumption is that the system, this educational system or the social system, is set to integrate, right? Integrate them, the marginalized, right? Them into a larger community. So the assumption is that we take this as a given, and then what we want to do is integrate them into society, right? There are those people outside on the periphery, and what we want to do is integrate them into society. And this doesn't sound like a bad thing at all, right? The people who are outside of society, and what we want to do is we just want to integrate them into society. I mean, the way that that's phrased, it doesn't even, it sounds completely harmless, right? There are people on the outside of society, and they're marginalized, right? And these marginalized people aren't within our society. And all that we want to do really is to take them outside of the society and bring them into our society, right? That's the assumption. Let's look at some of the problems with that, right? However, in that assumption, in this assumption of bringing them into, right? So this would be them. All of these people here would be them, and this would be us, right? Right? All of this is us. All of this is them. So it's us versus them. And what we want to do is we want to transform them, right? So it is the attempt to transform them to us, right? What we're attempting to do, all I'm attempting to do is to transform them into us, bring them into, integrate them into society, right? And Freire says this seems like a very logical thing to do. However, he argues this is problematic. And not only is it problematic, there's a litany of assumptions that are made, and these assumptions do a disservice to those who are already oppressed. What are some of the assumptions, right? So what are some of the assumptions of this? Okay. Okay. The first assumption, right? The first assumption is that there are marginalized people out there. The assumption is that there actually is a state of affairs within society wherein there are marginalized people out there. The problem is, however, this idea of being out there is fine when we're talking about out there in conceptual terms, right? There are people out there. However, it's perverse to talk about out there, not in conceptual terms, but in actual sort of topographical, geographical locations, right? Now we're talking about out there as, you know, oh, in Little Haiti or Jamaica Town or Little Havana or, you know, the community. And when I mean out there, I mean out there, right? It's wrong to do that, right? I'm not just going to make the claim that it's wrong to do that. We'll explain over time specifically how and why that attempt is wrong. But the out there-ness, if you will, the out there-ness conceptually, oh, there's marginalized people out there, you know, out in the world, is one thing. It's another thing to actually attempt to localize the out there, right? Because then we look at the communities, the sort of diversity of communities, and say that they are not like we are, right? They are out there, we're in here, and why can't they just join us, right? Okay, so that's the first assumption. The second assumption, so the first, I'll actually write it down, is the out there. So the first assumption is that there is this thing out there. We're assuming that there is an out there. The second assumption is that they, the marginalized people, need to be incorporated into quote-unquote a normal social structure, right? There is this attempt that they need to be part of us. They need to assimilate, right? This whole idea is one of assimilation, obviously, right? They, the marginalized people, need to assimilate to be more like us, right? Be less like you are and be more like we are, right? So that's the second assumption, right? The second assumption is that they need to be assimilated into, quote-unquote, a normal social structure. This idea of a normal social structure is, by definition, socially constructed, right? The norms in place, the rules, the regulations, the constructs that govern social interaction are always malleable, are always transforming, are always changing, are always open and subject to change. The fact that we're saying that they need to be more like us is inherently an act of paternalism, which we've seen. You need to be more like us because don't you see it's for your own good, right? If you're more like us, you'll get these social advantages and you'll be treated less like this. But if you don't, and if you're not like us, then we're going to treat you badly, and you should understand that we're going to treat you badly, right? So the idea is the assimilation into the population as a whole becomes forced, right? You need to be more like us. You ought to be more like us. But that assumption is that there is a difference to begin with, right? The assumption that they need to be and assimilate to become more like us assumes that there's a difference between them and us. In reality, it's a human being and a human being. Where is this they-us distinction, right? This they-us distinction is a condition of immediately viewing, assuming that there is this difference, and that this difference is, this difference needs to be transformed so that they are more like us. So, the second assumption is that there is a they, right? There is a they, right? So the first assumption is that there is this thing called the out there, wherever that is. The second assumption is that there is the they, right? Who are they? Well, you mean they're not like us? How are they not like us, right? That's the question you should be asking yourself critically, right? That's what Freire would want us to do. The third assumption in the text is that this process of incorporation requires acts of domestication, right? As Freire said in chapter 1, some of these acts of domestication are monologues and dialogues and diatribes, and it's the lecture, right? So that they are introduced into the society, they are introduced into our society, and their introduction to our society is met by me, the humble instructor. And the instructor begins the process of indoctrination, right? And I tell you, you need to know this, and you need to know this. To be a good member of society, you need to do what I do. You need to talk how I talk. You need to think how I think. You need to have the same content information that I have. Student raises their hand, but instructor, isn't it the case? No, see, that's why you're not learning, right? Because you are challenging what I'm saying. Listen to me if you want to pass my class, and hence the indoctrination. What have I done? I've pacified. I've domesticated my classroom. I've pacified. I've domesticated. I've held my authority and my power over the heads of my students, and they leave and transition out of my classroom into the real world, and they wait quietly for instruction. They become, as Freire said, automatons, right? Cogs in a machine. You ask them to think critically, and you're like, I don't even know what that means. And we can't fault them because we've never taught them how to think critically. And that we've never taught them is in itself loaded. We've never discovered is a better way of saying it. Freire would prefer me to say it in that sense, and I should say it in that sense, that we have never both mutually discovered critical thought, right? Because it's not something that's given to a student. It's something that through this collaborative effort, we, the instructor and the student, arrive at together, right? This critical consciousness, this critical thought. So the third assumption is that these people, so now we see that it's twofold assumption. They need to be more like us, right? First assumption, there is an up there. Second assumption, there is a they. Last assumption, they, whoever they are, the not us, they need to be more like us. It's paternalistic. It's for your own good. Be more like us. Life won't be so hard. Crap.